Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini as co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. We're going to visit on a subject I've spent a few hours on over my lifetime thinking about and trying to rein it in, and that's things called inflation. And a lot of people don't even know what inflation is because the government and the economists call it one thing, but in reality it's something else. And it's only Austrian economics that explains what inflation really is. And the first thing is understanding the definition and also what great harm it does. But the inflation really can be defined as a tax, and that is important, but it does a lot of other evil things. But it's a tax because the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, and that's what inflation is. Artificially increasing the money supply and manipulating interest rates. That's what inflation is all about. But they concentrate on making people believe it's only rising prices. So if prices go up because there's a hurricane, oh, inflation is coming back, or something like this. They are totally misled from this. And then in these last several years, when the economy wouldn't respond to all that QE, and they were baffled, well, we printed all this money, why aren't we having economic growth? But they don't understand anything about the malinvestment that occurs with the artificial increase in the money supply and interest rates that the Federal Reserve does. So they set out as their goal to have inflation, very similar to what Roosevelt and his crew did in the 30s. We got to get prices up. So it was so silly in the 30s. What they did is that if we could get prices up, the farmers would make more money and they'd spend the money and we have a recovery. So what they wanted to do, get prices up. The country, a good portion of it was starving, so they said, well, what we need to do is cut supplies. So they plowed the crops under and trying to push prices up, and that was their solutions. That's how silly it is. But since in these last several years, since the QEs weren't working, what they said is we have to work on prices going up. We have to have inflation. Now, if they had a lick of sense or a lick of morality in them, they say, you know what inflation is? It's a tax. It's a destruction of the value of money. It ruins the middle class. It undermines value and transfers value from the middle class to the very wealthy. And yet that is stated policy. Now understand, Chris, that they haven't let up on this. Obviously, they're not satisfied with what's going on, although the government statistics says everything is perfect. They're still working on, and they have not given up on the idea of let's push prices higher. And they call that inflation, but as prices going up, inflated prices, yes, but devaluation of the dollar. So I understand that the Fed still is maintaining that policy of 2%. Plus, they want it to even go up more, thinking that'll eventually get our economy out of the doldrums.
Yes, 2%, we wish. But yeah, their latest minutes came out and they said, quote, that they're looking for a temporary period of inflation modestly above 2%, and that would be consistent with the committee's symmetric inflation objective. So they want, in other words, they want higher prices. And when Americans go to work every day, they clock in, they're not making more money, they're making the same amount of money. But behind the scenes, there's the central bankers who are manipulating the economy and interest rates to make everything cost more. Isn't that nice of them, Dr. Paul?
That is just wonderful. And we all know, at least anybody who watches this program, that the Fed is responsible for this and the many economic problems we have in the size of government. But the Fed's tools that they use, they have several things they can do. They can just, out of thin air, create credit and buy treasury bills, which automatically puts a lot more money into circulation. They can change the reserve requirements and they can offer discount loans to the businesses. So there's a lot of different tools that they can use. But basically, it's printing money and buying up debt. And they even now, and they have always been permitted, but they do it more so now, especially since the crash of 2009 and 2008, is that they buy bonds other than government bonds. They're allowed to, and they will buy even government bonds of other countries. So they do prop up a lot of people, and that's the inflation. But they don't want you to think inflation has something to do with bad monetary policy at the Fed. The Fed does not want to be blamed. So what they do is they turn around and say, inflation, well, the businessman's making too much profit. The labor prices are too high. And they'll have all these arguments about why prices are going up, and they want to cut the prices, so they want to penalize people by cutting back when they think there's too much inflation. But right now, they don't think there's enough, so they want to inflate more. And now when they are admitting 2% is not enough, we better expect inflation to go up. But we've already known that the prices are starting to rise and have been rising a lot more than the government admits. They're probably closer to 4 or 5% right now. And yet that is their policy. They want to inflate the currency, thinking that this go around, inflating the currencies will solve all our problems. It won't contribute to debt. They won't admit that where some of this money goes is just to build up debt, or build up the government, or build up the coffers of the Wall Streeters, or to build up the coffers of the middle class and transfer the wealth from the middle class over to another group. So that fallacy in economic thinking has to be attacked, because if we just allow them to stick with, prices are up for this reason, if we lower prices, this is going to help, and that they have a job of economic planning through this manipulation of monetary policy and interest rates in order to control and give us a robust economy. You'd think one of these days they're going to have to admit, economic planning through the manipulation of monetary policy doesn't work, and they ought to, think about sound money and free markets.
Well, that would be wonderful. We'll get to that point someday. But until then, the next thing that I was going to point out is apparently I read that there are some Fed officials that are worried that once they get it past 2%, that it won't stay there, that prices may come back down. And that reminds me, I thought of a good analogy of a guy speeding down a highway. He's got a big mattress on his roof, and he's got his arm, and he's holding that mattress like he's in control of it. Well, what happens when prices spiral out of control? The Fed thinks that they can control it, that this is something like a machine, that they just turn a few screws here, hammer a few nails there. That's not the way the economy works. We're talking about humans with emotions and choice and their own values. And once things, especially prices, spiral out of control, you may not be able to bring them back.
Yeah, well, they believe they can. They believe in themselves, and they think they can regulate and just modify interest rates and the money supply rates, and they can correct that. They have total control. They're totally confident on it. But the one thing that has been proven over the years, especially in the 1970s, they believed they could do the old saying in the 60s, we could have guns and butter, and they inflated like crazy. And then they had to get off the gold standard. Inflation went crazy in the 70s. Then they had, what's going on here? We have a stagnant economy and prices are going up. We have stagflation. We don't know too much about that. So prices were soaring and going up. And they believe that what they do then, when it's sort of out of control, is not admit that it's the previous fallacies in the Federal Reserve monetary policy. They say what we have to do is have slower growth. We have to treat this problem with giving us a recession, and they literally then will say that we have to raise interest rates. But they didn't like to do that this go around because it was just overwhelming. But there's one part of inflation, there's lots of parts of inflation that they don't understand it and they can't control it. But the other part of inflation is what happens in fractional reserve banking. And not too many people talk about that. But if the Federal Reserve creates a dollar and puts it into circulation, they created the dollar out of circulation, and somebody gets this dollar and they put it in the bank. Well, the bank then says, well, the person that put the dollar in the bank, that's his dollar. But if I can loan it to somebody else, I will, because the person who put the money in the bank, he might not claim it for a week or two. So we'll not hold 100% reserves there on these deposits. So what they'll do is they'll loan it out to somebody else. So instantaneously, if they can do that within minutes, matter of fact, they can loan you money and you put it back in the bank in a checking account, they have twice as much money that they can loan out. Well, if they could do that once, it wouldn't be so bad. It still would be wrong. But what happens is next go around, and before you know it, it's a pyramid scheme. And they can put $1 into circulation, and it might multiply up to 7 times, 8 times, 9 times. All depends on the velocity of money, how often people want to spend it. And the banks, the Federal Reserve, they just don't have control of this. So the Fed does something else to deflect from their responsibility, and that is prices are going up too fast. And we have to blame somebody, not the Fed, but blame the people who are charging the prices. So what do? They put wage and price controls on because people are making too much money and the prices are too high. And wage and price controls were used many times in our history. I remember it being in World War II. I remember it during the Korean War and also in the 70s. And every time it's a total failure. And they've been used for thousands of years because there's inflation has been around that long. But and the penalties are always very severe. The more authoritarian a society is, the more socialistic, communistic it is. If you break those rules on price controls, it's very, very serious. Those are criminal offenses, and in the Soviet system, the penalties were very bad. And even in our system, it can be very ruthless. But that doesn't work, so they're still refusing to admit the fallacy of the monetary system. They have to realize what they're doing is they're taxing us. And you say, how do you mean they're taxing us? Well, if they print enough money to double the money supply, what you say is, well, if you have twice as much supply and no increase in production, prices have to go up twice as much. And the value of your dollar goes down 50%. So the money in your wallet, if you have $100 in your wallet and they double the money supply, in theory you could say, well, my $100 is now worth $50. So they can steal the money, the wealth, the spending ability out of your wallet without even touching you. So it is a wonderful gimmick for the big government spenders, and that is over and above what the deficit is showing. But that's the other big gimmick. They use this power to inflate and pay the bills. Is it the benefit for the two political parties that control us? And that is Republicans and Democrats have different reasons to spend money, but the deficit has run up. It's hard to turn off the machine like it is right now. So the deficit explodes. The deficit has to explode under these conditions, especially when they get to the point of refusal to do the right things. And this is the reason that there's a calamity waiting for us, because there's an inability now. In the old days, even in the Depression, they tried to solve the problem, painfully though, they did. But they would just turn off the money machine, and the Depression would last a year or two, and they'd go back to a little bit more sensible policy. But that is not the case. So inflation is a tax, and inflation is theft. Inflation is immoral. Inflation finances big government. Inflation finances the war. Boy, why would you ever want to turn all those wonderful things off? So we who believe in sound money, Chris, they're not looking for our answers. Matter of fact, they did just as soon that nobody hears about them, and they do a pretty good job, because and I know that not much of Austrian economics is ever taught in any of our universities.
Yes, and there's no help from the media. There's no helping from college professors. Thankfully for the internet, we could get this message out. But like you mentioned, this whole thing is a calamity, because right now they're trying to drive prices up. And then once prices are higher and everybody is complaining that food costs so much, gas costs so much, guess what they all do? They flip the media and said, the Fed has to come and fight inflation. Yeah. Now the Fed has to come save us. It's ridiculous. They created the inflation. And what happens then is they raise interest rates, and then they pop all the bubbles they created. So it's a calamity from start to finish, and they just keep repeating it because they get rich off of it. But someday we got to break out of this cycle.
Yeah, and we pointed out to them, Austrian economists pointed out and showed that what they're doing is they create our booms and our bust periods, our inflation, and the corrections and the depressions and recessions and all the other mischief. And when I would bring the subject up to the Federal Reserve Board chairman on the banking committee, they really didn't say, oh, you're wrong, that doesn't happen, and there has to be, some adjustments, and we know that. But as long as it's orderly, as long as the transition of the dollar being, if it's worth $1 today, they don't want it worth 10 cents tomorrow. That's not orderly. But for it to go down to 90 cents or then down to 85 cents over a long period of time, they believe they can contain it. And theoretically, it helps because people don't panic. But when you lose control, and you mentioned how long can the Fed have control, when they lose control, then the velocity of money goes very, very quickly, and the money gets spent much faster, and then you run into runaway inflation, and then you get to the point of having something like Zimbabwe or Venezuela, and that's not orderly, and that's when you have chaos, and that's when they panic and they want to put on control. But economically speaking, and for a healthy economy, people should think about a prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth a lot more than these tons of pain and suffering that people have to suffer from. And some of people will still come back to us, Chris, we're hearing this. They come back and say, well, things are going very well. There's less regulations and taxes went down a little bit and everybody's feeling good. And the news reports that, and a lot of people want to feel good, but there's a lot of discontent. There wouldn't be this much discontent if it was working so well. But the other characteristic of systematic, even if it seems to be orderly, systematic destruction of the value of the currency, it systematically undermines the middle class. And that is where I see the big problem. The destruction of the middle class, the contentiousness between the wealthy and the poor, the lower 50% and the top 1 or 2 or 3%, and the wealth just goes and accumulates. And then the real philosophic problem that we have is that the demagogues get hold of this and say, see, free enterprise and freedom doesn't work. It's these people who believe in free enterprise that has caused this problem, and they refuse to say, maybe it's the Fed, maybe it's crony capitalism, maybe it's the politicians who get hold of this money, and maybe it's the special interest, and that is why we have, half of the country that gets poorer and poorer, if it's not more than that half of the country, and that's why, the demagogues and the socialists and the, Marxists are coming along now and getting a little bit of attention, because in one way they're right. There is a problem. This is unfair. This is not freedom. This has to do with a crony capitalist society that has control of a monetary system which is bigger and more involved worldwide than ever before. The fiat dollar is engaged in a system that never existed in all history. And other currencies are linked to us one way or the other because we've been a reserve currency. And all you have to do is pick up the papers now and read about the challenges going on. Russia still has their economic problems, and they're trying to work their way away from the Soviet system. But they're buying up gold, just like China. They're buying up gold, the real money. And eventually there will be monetary reform. And when it happens, I believe that gold is going to be involved in this reform because you can't restore confidence by saying to the government, look, just print more money and we'll work hard and there'll be a healthy economy. So, Chris, I don't see an immediate answer in Washington, resolving this. I saw a little hint of it while I was there because we actually got the Audit the Fed bill passed a couple times in the House. So there is attention given to the real problem, and I think that's what we should continue to do, make this point. And I think we who believe this way have an obligation to spread this message the best we can because it's the understanding of the people. If the people say deficits don't matter, our professors tell us that printing money is okay, as long as they believe that and they think on the short run they're going to do better, they're okay. But when they realize the relationship of what's happening on monetary policy and spending, they might say, well, maybe their best interests are served by listening to those who promote sound money and free market economics.
Yes, very good, Dr. Paul. I'll just finish with bringing up the Constitution. This may surprise some people, but we deal with unconstitutional money every single day of our lives. The Constitution says that gold and silver our money. And that wasn't decreed by the founding fathers. They didn't say gold and silver is money because we say so. They went out into the marketplace and saw what people were using on their own without any force. And that's how they came up with the laws that they came up with. And the Constitution has never been amended. That law is still on the books. It's just totally ignored. And we're forced to use these Federal Reserve dollars as long as people put up with it. And I guess we'll see what happens going forward. But the more that people understand, the better.
Yes, and obviously this argument's been going on for many, many centuries. Certainly was going on with the founding of this country. We had the Hamiltonians fighting with the Jeffersonians. Hamilton wanted the central bank and didn't worry about deficits. And then we also had Jefferson, who didn't like central banking and liked gold and a more conservative approach to government. But unfortunately, from the very beginning, it tended to be that the believers in deficits and printing money, they tended to win the day. And unfortunately, over the many years, when there had been challenges like during the Civil War period and during the Depression, anytime there was a court case trying to do what you were suggesting, that why don't we listen to the Constitution, when there was a pressing, for gold contracts and what was going on and suspension of the gold standard, the courts always ruled in favor of the banks and the central banks and the printing of money, because that was part of the philosophy that people endorsed. So to me, it's an economic argument, it's a philosophic argument, it's the demagogues that politicize it, and they can gain votes this way. So the answer is that this message of liberty and sound money has to get out, but we have to convince people their best interests are served by believing in sound money, because it restrains the government. That's the biggest thing. Big government has to have control over the money, and that is why they have legal tender laws. They don't want competition, and I have emphasized for a long time freedom to compete as long as there's no fraud involved, and that his argument is going on now. So the more we hear in that and repeal the legal tender laws and allow people to use what they think is best, for money, and using a commodity standard if they so choose, that is what we should have. Defense and the promotion of liberty will solve a lot of our problems. I want to thank all of you for joining us today with the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.